Hi, and welcome to this episode of Step Change Conversations. Today we're joined by Dr. Francesca Cagnacci, who is a senior researcher who focuses on behavioral and conservation ecology, but also is one of our Step Change advisors who has worked alongside us with our CSI based on citizen science and wildlife monitoring. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So just as a brief introduction, could you talk a little bit about your background and how you got into citizen science and the work that you do with ecology, I suppose?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very interesting question in general to consider how and why citizen science entered into our research, and it has been increasingly doing so. I am a behavioral ecologist, and as such, I consider my lab to be out there, so the environment that we share between wildlife and people. So from the very beginning, more than, about 20 years ago now, I started to talk to stakeholders first and the general citizens after about the questions that I was addressing, the scope of my research, and of course the results. And I've been deploying with a pilot study the GPS telemetry collars for the first time on road here in the Alps. So the curiosity about the technology that wasn't so common back then, it was just allowed to common citizens to use GPS. It was really like a very nice hook to involve people, to get people's interest. And then little by little, we moved towards involving them in our questions and also obtaining information from them. At the beginning, there would be general information, such as the distribution of animals and where to potentially catch them, to collar and release them, or what were their general impressions about the status of the different species. But then it was the same technological hook that little by little took us closer to the citizens, and especially with the use of camera trapping. I'm, again, a behavioral ecologist on wildlife species, especially large mammals. So camera trapping is becoming such an important tool. And it's really nice, the arch that took myself and in general several of my colleagues from explaining the technology to people to actually share the same technology, maybe for different reasons, for different approaches, but definitely potentially including the same types of data in certain studies. And so this is how I became very interested into citizen science. And it's really somehow that category that allowed me to complete this arch from trying to, bring on the people's interest to actually share the same interest with them.
It's really interesting to see. I'm a zoologist / ecologist by training in the way back when I was back at university, but I have kind of helped out with some volunteering and some data collecting, and it's come on leaps and bounds since even kind of 5-10 years ago, really, with, I don't know, the amount of technology that people can kind of access just due to their smartphones, and yeah, kind of the ability for people to get involved, I suppose.
Exactly. Say the distance that we have between the science we produce and the possibility for people to understand what we're talking about is shorter and shorter. And so we should really make an effort to take advantage of this possibility, not only to make our, science more understandable, but also really like to obtain more data and more information than what we would be able to do otherwise. And it's one of those win-win situations that is mediated by technology. That it's for once is a good aspect of our times, and I think that the effort should, for example, go in the direction of the phone apps. So for sure, mobile phones are that type of a media that is closer to most species, even more than computers or laptops. And so finding the right app to communicate to people and obtain data from them, such as many have done before, has been incredibly successful and has brought so many more people closer to science. And then as a secondary, maybe more sociological component, which is not my field, but I think it's very interesting, is the fact of getting people more aware of what we mean a fact-based knowledge, so that we really need observations, and then to analyze observation robustly, and everything starts from there. So I think that this is one of the most important components of citizen science.
Previously, perhaps citizen science, especially perhaps within the field of ecology and the environment, might have been primarily seen as kind of boots on the ground, kind of data collection and that sort of thing. But it's definitely moved beyond that a little bit. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the extended role that citizen groups and other stakeholders have in wildlife monitoring and conservation as a wider topic, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there used to be some groups of interest, especially in some parts of Europe, for example, the UK and also elsewhere, that were interested into collecting observations. So they would do that by participating into ringing campaigns, for example, to recognize birds. So birds would be misnetted every migration time, fitted a ring, and then of course released to be free, and then captured again. And this was like, it's the U-ring initiative that has been going on for a century. So it's really, like it really dates back to old times when ecology was almost not a thing as yet, if not into Darwin's words. And then it has moved on into more specialized passions, for example, about insect collections, that also helped out museums or butterfly catching and observations in particular, like very, very specific groups of interests and passions. But there was a moment in which there was almost a conflict, in a sense, between these groups of interests and the way the scientists wanted to be seen. Well, I'm a real scientist. I'm not doing it for passion. It's a job, And then, as I said before, the technology really allowed us to move on and have two types of groups. I mean, for sure, we still have those that, as you said, would like, to see themselves with boots on ground and really obtain data the classic way. But we also have kids in the schools that are able to look at pictures obtained with the camera trapping and classify them, and maybe do some projects about that and obtain little gifts or awards, and really being involved in allowing a small bit done by many into a big data output. And like camera trapping, I think, is the most outstanding example, say, for wildlife, but there are others. But it's really the concept to not to limit the accessibility to science to a certain specific group of interests among citizens, which of course should still happen, but to really broaden and somehow find good tasks for everyone. Another one that I have in mind is all the work that is spread around Europe on the conservation of hedgehogs. That really is allowed by normal, citizens that are not particularly, they don't have a background in natural science, or it's not really the fact that they have a hedgehog knowledge per se, but they just know that they are at risk in our new establishments, in our new settlements, and with many new risks. And so they set out like a small trap, and to make sure that they can stay over the winter and be safe. And so and then they communicate through small chips all their results. So it's really the capability to again find the right win-win situation for many problems involving as many categories and groups of citizens as possible.
And I suppose, yes, part of the work you do, it allows for certain groups of people who may not be able to get out to the environment to experience and see kind of the work that your conservation efforts do, I suppose, but also in part to work with these, like you say, these community groups, so like hikers, hunters, fisher people, and kind of gain very much kind of insights from people who may not be who are non-academic researchers in kind of like, or experts in quotation marks, but have kind of an innate kind of information that you might not have being siloed kind of within your research institute, I suppose.
Exactly. And I think it is very important to consider that becoming close to science allows to understand science and also somehow love the topic that science studies. Quite a few years ago, I gave a TED talk, and in that one, I would really say that we respect what we know, and that we can only know by really being involved. So it's when we again short the distance between the questions of science and different groups of people, which means that not necessarily it is easier to involve local people, to become a little bit more personal. Local people may be closer to nature. I mean, when I say local people, of course, I'm referring to the specific context I'm studying with, which is the Alps, and it's the mountain valleys, the small villages. And people from the cities may have this idea that, you know, you live with Heidi and you love and know nature, but it's not exactly like that, because when you live in a small place and in a valley, maybe by tradition or through family, you really have other focus, you know, like you need to make a living, you know, to stay and keep living in a context that it might not be the easiest to live within. And so nature sometimes may also be your, not enemy, but at least, you know, a sort of context of conflict, for example, as it happens with large carnivores, and vice versa. When you work with citizens from the cities, they may have a sort of a mythic, you know, like a image of what nature is, and so try to fit it into a very anthropomorphic categories. And so citizen science allows us to go beyond these stereotypes, and to using a bit of grain of salt and maybe also the consultancy of sociologists to find the right target for the different groups, and somehow advancing them towards good science, and for us to have a more informed audience and better data.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that links quite nicely to my next question, I suppose, with working with citizen science groups. Again, some of these might be kind of experts in their own right, but others may or may not be as familiar as other types of people who do this research, the research that you do yourself, of course. I'm just wondering about how, because a major part of this CSI that we're doing with the University of Primorska is sort of a comparative study between the data collected by citizen scientists and those collected by more traditional means, and kind of validating the citizen science data, I suppose. I'm just wondering how the inputs from these non-experts or these citizen scientists, I suppose, does it need validation? Is there a vetting sort of system? How do you kind of convert kind of the observations from, I don't want to say lay audiences, but from perceived non-experts, which can then be used in studies which may not just be your studies if you're participating in kind of a larger initiative with some knowledge transfer and that sort of thing. I'm just wondering how
it works,
how that works.
Yeah, this is very important. And actually, as you said, it links back to what I was saying before. So to identify the right target and the right task for the different groups of interest or the different categories of citizens. We will have, for example, input detections of several species from either a mobile phone app or camera trapping derived photos interpreted by a group of, say, general citizens, for example, school kids, or just interested people that would like to occupy their free time in a useful way, and somehow giving some feedback to science. And those would be sort of less informed inputs that, however, can be trained through, for example, some indications. In case of school kids, that would be clear. There would be some training data sets. They would learn to do the job, and then they would apply themselves, and they would be scored according to self-scored according to their abilities, and then try to self-improve their abilities. And it's very nice because it's very easy to set this into sort of a game. So sort of a gaming context. And it's not by chance that I mention the school kids all the time in these tasks. But also you may instead just download the app, have it on your phone, go out and try to identify a certain plant or a certain bird, and etc. And so here it's a bit more complicated to check. Either way, we need to validate the inputs from less experts in order for them to be used, which means to, again, really say good, bad. And then what is the advantage? The advantage is that I have more observations, and so I have bigger data and my science is more robust, but also that I can go back and feedback to those inputs and so improve my further on input from the same group of people. This can happen via a more classic involvement of the second category of citizens, which is the more expert ones. For example, those that have natural science background, or they're just passionate, but with a very well proved knowledge about a certain type of, for example, a certain group of species, like birders, for example, or just insect passionates, as we were mentioning before. These people would somehow pass to a second level of knowledge with respect to the wider audience and validate their observations by linking the actual observation with some evidence, should that be, for example, a photo or an audio or some other types. And then, of course, we are in 2020 past or 2020 periods, and we cannot we cannot forget about the input of AI. So artificial intelligence is the next level to validate observations, and it really relies on those observations as well for the validation. So that's the critical point. You can only utilize AI to make the computer working better if you really have a lot of citizen science inputs that can be processed. And of course, you also need those from scientists or more expert people to be the validating group of observations. So these two levels, a more sort of hands-on versus an AI-based, can be really combined. The former can be utilized for the second purpose if it becomes large enough. And we really have impressive progress in this sense. We have initiatives that can cover the possibility to obtain occurrence of certain mammals, for example, of bird songs or plant types worldwide. And we will understand in just a few years how impressive this is. And if I can add something, as our impact on the planet becomes ever more strong and difficult to deal with, to be on the doom side, we also have an increasing awareness that especially passes by citizen science. And so the same potential group of people that are part of the problem, they may actually become an amazing component of the solution.
No, that's really interesting. It sounds a little bit like it's kind of a bottom-up kind of feedback loop where you might need to put in additional work to begin with to get the infrastructure in and then the validation. But as soon as it feeds back into itself to improve future attempts, future kind of approaches, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And the utilization of AI is also something that pulls people's curiosity because we know that this is done also for humans, right? I mean, it's done all the time. We look at our mobile phone and then, you know, we are automatically directed to the payment profile because the phone knows it's us, or every time we try to identify some of our relatives or friends in the pictures. So we know that all these systems are now embedded in very functional and efficient packages in our daily life, and the same can translate into science, and especially for wildlife studies.
Just to go back a little bit to the point, again, not meaning to be too doom and gloom, but yes, the effects of climate change, the effects of habitat loss and that sort of thing, then obviously they're on the increase, but they're also not kind of, well, in some in some kind of statements they are, but wildlife doesn't really revolve around borders or boundaries or state lines or anything like that. So I'm kind of wanted to ask you because a lot of work that you do seems to be very, well, either encompassing a lot of European countries or even beyond. And I'm just wondering, about kind of how that knowledge transfer can be used for broad policy change, perhaps. Can it be used for wide encompassing kind of attempts for conservation? And also, do other countries, in your experience, seem to have a different perception or different kind of attitude towards citizen science in this kind of degree, would you say?
Yeah. So I'll go back to talk about my science a bit to answer this question. I've previously mentioned my local studies. I am a behavioral ecologist studying large mammal movement ecology in the alpine area for my empirical studies, but I'm also initiator of the Euromammals initiative. That is probably one of the largest initiatives in Europe to study mammals. We pull together researchers, but also natural parks, protected areas in general, and non-academic bodies, and potentially also NGOs with the science orientation. And this really allows us to have a very good basis to translate our scientific needs at a global, well, at least continental scale, into potential requests to establish this link with citizens. So how to say, we need to collaborate bottom up among scientists in order to be able to really pull the resource of citizens and having a very effective citizen science. It would be very contradictory to seek for citizen science if we are not able to provide a very good example, a very good instance of collaboration among ourselves, not only as pure scientists, but let's say as more experts, the category we were referring to before, together with scientists. For example, why does it matter? For example, it matters because we need to establish standards to obtain the data from citizens. And those that are establishing the standards are the scientists that know the species, know what are the elements of life history or habitat types or potential drivers that we need to identify. So yeah, we need a very solid, robust research and science on the effects of impact on effects of climate change and human impacts in general, in order to nail those specific aspects that can be answered by citizen science. And again, we do this by collaborating. Another example that I can pull from my current involvement, well, one is the COVID-19 biologging initiative, where we try to put together the data that had been collected by not only scientists, but also, again, wildlife biologists or local protected areas during the COVID times, due to the lockdown, that we took in the context of the Biologging Society as a somehow, dramatic, with an example of with a dramatic origin, which was the pandemic. but also as a way to really, put together an experiment at large scale to understand what the presence of humans in the environment matters for wildlife from different points of view. And this couldn't have happened without putting together the effort of many that, again, are not only purely scientists, but also really doing their job in a certain context. And from this, we could imagine to have a network of monitoring based on citizen science that is somehow ready to catch those pulses in the effects of humans that we may observe through time. What I mean is that we, of course, we don't hope for another pandemic to happen, but we have other aspects that we should consider. For example, these natural disasters that, because of climate change, are becoming more and more of a case often, or the fluctuation of traffic because of holidays, or unfortunately also dramatic war situations. And so if we do establish a worldwide network of observers through citizens, we are ready to catch the situation that is somehow exceptional or different or is fluctuating, and find solid answers at the global scale. And again, via this attitude, we can provide robust evidence, like it has been done with CO2, also for the relationships between humans and wildlife, and the dramatic biodiversity loss that we are observing. And so with this, I get to my final example coming from my research, which is the Global Initiative on Ungulate Migration. So some animals migrate. What does it mean? It means that they don't live in one place, but they need in multiple places. In ecology, we mention migration as a seasonal phenomenon, not a lifetime phenomenon. That one would be dispersal. And some large mammals, especially ungulates. Ungulates are essentially those animals that walk on nails, and they are species they put together species such as deer, like roe deer, red deer, or mountain ungulates, chamois, ibex, or even the wildebeest in Serengeti, or elephants. So we really have a huge diversity within these groups, and they are important, super important, because they are the so-called primary consumers. So they graze or browse, they use vegetation, and they at the same time build up meat that allows us to close the circle for carnivores, and sometimes also our consumption, or our domesticated animals. Most of our domesticated animals are ruminants and ungulates for milk or meat production. So in this case, we can really see how these animals moving around in the seasonal movements is fundamental to circulate seeds and energy and nutrients. So it's not only the fact that they are there, but the fact that they move that is important. And this takes the possibility to involve citizen science to a next level. Okay, so we really need to make this project into something that can obtain data from citizens, at the same time transfer these key concepts, so that animals are important not just as static postcards, but as really living beings and histories and cultures. But here we have one specific group of citizens that is particularly important. Migrations of animals have been fundamental for many indigenous people that these days are as threatened as the species that they rely upon. And we have some historical dramatic examples. For example, the American bison and Native Americans, they've been both extirpated at the same time. Actually, the Native Americans have been extirpated by de facto almost extirpating their staple wild food. And this case applies to many indigenous groups around the world. So it really shows how citizen science may become a very deep, complex way to put together not only purely wildlife problems, but also societal and human instances that might go unseen.
I think that's a really good kind of bridge just to my final question, I suppose. Just going back a little bit to the Step Change initiative on wildlife conservation in Slovenia. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your work that has been involved with this CSI and how you kind of see the work that's been done in Slovenia kind of impacting kind of future projects or future legislation to do with conservation, I suppose.
Yeah, so I was really honored to be involved as an advisor in this project because I was well, I had great esteem of the colleagues who started the project, but I was also impressed by their ability to take the concept of citizen science at all levels. I've clearly mainly spoken about my own citizen science that is based on the job I do. So I'm a wildlife movement ecologist working with large mammals. But they were able to take the whole stack, coming, from genes to the complexity of populations, and also to be very aware of the need to involve the instances and requests from different stakeholders groups. And on this, in Slovenia, there is a long tradition to include stakeholders such as farmers and hunters and conservation groups into decisions. Slovenia in particular, it's a small country, but with an impressive biodiversity that has become a reference for many other European countries. And this really happened, I believe, through this truly bottom-up, like not artificial bottom-up, but truly bottom-up initiative. And in Step Change, this is taken to a next level, both in terms of technological terms, because everything we have been mentioning about, AI and also other things I haven't spoken about because they are not my topic. For example, the capability to obtain genetic samples and to really involve the small communities into that, to the actual translation of this into clear outputs and suggestions and advice for policy making. The difficulty here that is fully addressed by Step Change is that it's easy to say policy, right? But what policy at what level? And here we become, things become as complicated as the word is, right? Because we have global policies and big statements at the UN, UNEP, the United Nations chapter for environmental protection level. So, like the 2030 challenges and priorities of the UN for conservation, nature conservation. But this doesn't happen if we don't have some legislations or directive, we would say, in EU to bring together instances from different countries more concretely into one direction. And then again, we can go down to the country level, and from the country level to the county level, because after all, conservation and citizen science happens exactly at that spot. And that's why citizen science can make the trick, because after all, it's the citizens that is close to the place where conservation can happen. And it's only the citizen and not those that are deciding things or suggesting things at a very generic level. It doesn't happen if it doesn't happen there. So I think that Step Change has really made a trick to put together these two levels in a very regional, innovative, and brilliant way. And I have been advising on some protocols to make this happen, to ways with which certain protocols could be communicated to citizens, and I'm still looking forward for the next challenge to happen within the Step Change framework and beyond.
No, that's really interesting. So it kind of, you speak about sort of like the granular level of being the conservation efforts that need to be within certain communities, within certain species within those niches, but also from that, it seems that it builds up public opinion, and from that public opinion comes more legislation that comes up the ladder, which then goes up the ladder, which then goes up the ladder again, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And step change, right? If you miss a step, it falls down.
Exactly. Yeah. What a nice sort of a little soundbite to end on. So just want to say thank you very much for joining us today for this great conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris. It's been really great talking to the audience and being involved in this project in the first place.